International terrorism is quite definitely a serious problem. It's a problem which should be high on anyone's agenda. About a year ago, at the end of 1985, a poll of editors, mostly in the United States, partly around the world, selected Mideast Mediterranean terrorism as the top story of 1985. Actually, that poll was taken prior to the terrorist attacks at the Vienna and Rome airports, which no doubt would have eliminated any remaining indecisiveness about the choice of this as the major story of 1985. These December 1985 airport attacks were attributed by the U.S. government and the U.S. media to Libya. There was no evidence for that at the time, and the story has been tacitly dropped, not, however, before it was used, for example, by the editors of the New York Times as a justification for the American bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi last April. Through 1986, international terrorism remained a major preoccupation, and it still does, particularly in the Middle East Mediterranean region. It has been the issue of international terrorism, particularly in that region, has been the topic of innumerable commentaries in the press, of a long series of conferences, of many volumes, and in general much agonized commentary and public opinion as well. And in fact, this concern is certainly warranted. International terrorism is a major issue, and we should be concerned about it, although some questions arise about the nature of international terrorism if we take a somewhat closer look. If we want to approach this topic in a sensible way and to consider a possible remedy to this plague that is undermining modern civilization, we have to begin by asking first just what is terrorism, and then we have to ask where is the locus of responsibility for terrorist actions. Only then can we turn sensibly to the question of a remedy. Now, as I mentioned, there has been a great deal of agonized debate about what the remedy should be, but in fact the remedy is surprisingly simple, although for some reason it is always overlooked. Well, let's begin by asking what is terrorism. Here at least there's a fair degree of agreement. It's generally agreed that the term terrorism refers to the threat or use of violence, generally against civilians, generally for some political end. Terrorism occurs in various varieties. It's international terrorism when it crosses state boundaries. There's state terrorism and individual terrorism, depending on the agency. There's small-scale terrorism directed against small groups or individuals, and there's large-scale wholesale terrorism, which targets large groups, sometimes whole populations. So we have to make a distinction between retail and wholesale terrorism, between state and individual terrorism. We also have to be careful to distinguish terrorism from aggression or complicity in aggression. These are far more serious crimes. These are the crimes for which people were hanged at Tokyo and Nuremberg with much noble rhetoric about how this was not victor's justice, it was not judicial murder, as proven by the fact that we would insist that the same standards apply to us in the subsequent period. So I'm going to exclude from this discussion the crime of aggression or complicity of aggression, war crimes. For example, I'll exclude such events as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. attack against South Vietnam, then all of Indochina, the U.S.-backed Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which in fact is the source of much of the contemporary Mideast terrorism, or the U.S.-backed Indonesian invasion of Timor, East Timor, which still continues. A new offensive is now going on, as always, with crucial U.S. Military, diplomatic, and ideological support. The ideological support consisting in the refusal of the media to report the facts as they occur, as has been going on for 10 years, and secondly, their concealment of the decisive U.S. role in their occasional timid reconstructions of what happened years ago. Sometimes it's not clear how to characterize some event as international terrorism or aggression, and sometimes, in fact, there's a transition between the two. So, for example, take South Vietnam. In 1954, after the Geneva Agreements, which established the basis for peace in Indochina, the United States immediately committed itself to undermining the peace agreements. The part of that effort was in South Vietnam, where the United States installed a Latin American-style terrorist state, which by 1960 had slaughtered perhaps 75 or 80,000 people. This is international terrorism. That is, it was a client mercenary state with a mercenary army trained and armed by the United States and set out to attack and assault the population. This aroused resistance, which the client government was unable to contain. So in 1962, the United States simply attacked South Vietnam directly. The U.S. Air Force began regular bombardment and defoliation in South Vietnam. So there's a case of a transition from wholesale international terrorism to outright aggression, a war crime, the crime for which people were hanged at Tokyo and Nuremberg. And there are other cases of such transitions, and there are other cases of difficulty of categorization. I will here give the benefit of the doubt to the United States and its clients, and whenever there's a case where you might categorize it as either international terrorism or aggression, when the United States or client states are involved, I will, as I say, give the United States the benefit of the doubt and classify it as the less extreme crime of international terrorism. Well, let's now focus on international terrorism, not aggression, and ask the second question: where is the locus of responsibility? Well, in fact, it's widely distributed. International terrorism has many sources. If we're going to be reasonable about it, we'll begin by concentrating on the most serious cases. Then if we had several weeks to talk, we could get down to the minor cases. So let's begin with the major cases, keeping now to the 1980s. The 1980s is the period when international terrorism has moved to center stage. By far the most serious cases of international terrorism in the 1980s, outweighing all others by a large margin, are in Central America, primarily in El Salvador and Guatemala. In El Salvador, the United States established a mercenary army which has dedicated itself to slaughter, torture, murder. By now, some 60,000 people have been killed in the 1980s by a rather conservative estimate by the U.S. mercenary forces. That's international terrorism. The purpose of the U.S. organized assault was to destroy the popular organizations fighting to defend their fundamental human rights. That was the phrase used by the martyred Archbishop Romero shortly before his assassination by the U.S. trained security forces in March 1980. It was a phrase that appeared in his letter to President Carter, where he pleaded with President Carter not to send aid to the military junta, since that aid would be used again to destroy the popular organizations fighting to defend their fundamental human rights. The aid was sent, that being its purpose, and in fact that end was carried out. This slaughter was largely successful. That is, the popular organizations were decimated, the media were destroyed, the political opposition was assassinated, and all of this, notice, this is the major exercise of international terrorism in recent years, and it's very much welcomed in the United States, particularly by American liberals who laud this achievement and speak of El Salvador as a fledgling democracy. We can even read in the Boston Globe by Edward Sheehan that it has a free press now that the church radio stations have been bombed out of existence, that the editors of the independent press have been tortured and murdered and driven out of the country, and the press destroyed, and so on and so forth. And in general, there's widespread apologetics and applause for this terrorism. The man primarily responsible for it, Jose Napoleon Duarte, is hailed in the United States as a great hero. He was just awarded an honorary degree right here at Boston University, among other examples of praise and awe for his achievements. In the bloody history of Latin America, and it is bloody, there is no other single individual who has responsibility for so many deaths as Jose Napoleon Duarte, and it is therefore not surprising that he should be lauded by the liberal educated elites in the world's most violent terrorist state. In Guatemala, the story is pretty much the same. The scale of killings in the 1980s is probably higher. Here, too, the United States participated with much enthusiasm. During the Carter years, contrary to many falsehoods, the United States continued to send arms to Guatemala at roughly the normal rate during a period of extensive killings and murders. In the Reagan years in the 1980s, the support for near genocide became virtually ecstatic, and U.S. aid substantially increased. Here, however, there were some impediments imposed by Congress, so the United States had to use mercenary states, client states. Throughout the region, it made use of the neo-Nazi Argentine generals, serving as a proxy for the United States, in the words of RAND Corporation terrorism expert Brian Jenkins. It made use of Taiwan, and particularly Israel, which lent its services enthusiastically to the cause of mass slaughter in Guatemala. And this, in fact, is one of the factors that relates to terrorism in the Middle East, back to which I'll return. Then there's the case of Nicaragua. About 40 or 50,000 people were killed in the last paroxysm of violence of the Somoza regime, again, contrary to many lies supported by the United States, by the Carter administration throughout, till the very end. Also, though Carter here, too, had to call upon his Israeli mercenaries to evade congressional restrictions and provide the arms during this last period of slaughter. During the 1980s, Nicaragua has been attacked by a U.S. proxy army. That's the term that's used in internal White House documents. The loyal media, ever serving their master, refer to the proxy army as the resistance, as you'll notice. The U.S. proxy army attacking Nicaragua has been less successful in carrying out slaughter and terror than the U.S. mercenary army in El Salvador or the U.S.-supported forces in Guatemala. The reason is that in Nicaragua, the population has an army to protect it, whereas in El Salvador, the terrorist forces are the army. That is, the mercenary forces established, trained, organized, and supplied by the United States. All of this is international terrorism at a very substantial scale. Going back to 78, it amounts to about 200,000 people killed, not insignificant. Furthermore, this is not just killing. This is torture, rape, mutilation. In fact, it's terror in the style of Pol Pot, and in fact even on the scale of Pol Pot, a fact that would surprise brainwashed Americans who are carefully insulated from the actual facts. The conclusion is very simple. Washington has been, during the 1980s, the world's leading center of international terrorism, and that suggests a rather simple remedy for this plague that threatens the world, namely, close down Washington. Well, let's turn to the Middle East Mediterranean region. That's the region that the media and other ideological institutions tell us that we are to focus attention upon when we consider the plague of international terrorism and when we lament its victims. So let's begin with the year 1986, a year of considerable international terrorism in the Middle East Mediterranean region. The worst single case of international terrorism in that year was the U.S. bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi of Libya in April. That led to about 100 people killed, mostly civilians. Now, there was an official reason given for the bombing attack against Libya. Notice again that this could be called aggression, a much more serious crime, a war crime, but continuing with the practice of giving the United States the benefit of the doubt, I'll call it only international terrorism. The official reason for this attack given by the White House was, in its words, that this was self-defense against future attack. Self-defense against future attack. And it was also claimed that this was fully in accord with international law. Well, that's an interesting proposal. It's actually a novel idea. I don't think it's ever been proposed before. This goes beyond any right claimed by Hitler, for example. I will not spend any time, I leave it to your imagination, to figure out the implications if other states also were to adopt this conception that they're entitled to undertake self-defense against future attack by bombing anybody they think might threaten them in the future. This act of international terrorism was, again, very widely applauded in the United States, in particular by American liberals who were particularly enthusiastic about it. Anthony Lewis in the New York Times, for example, was very much impressed by this appeal to international law. He also explained that the killing of innocent civilians was quite justified because if we didn't do it, terrorists would not be deterred. By that principle, it would be entirely legitimate for many people around the world to bomb Washington, aiming at Reagan and Schultz and other terrorist commanders, and this would be fully justified even if innumerable innocent civilians were killed, because otherwise how can terrorists be deterred? In fact, it would be justified even if hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians were killed if we use the standards for legitimate retaliation that have been proclaimed and in fact employed by the United States. Well, let's look a bit more closely at the bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi, the year's most extreme act of international terrorism. This took place on April 14th. It is the first bombing in history that was literally staged for primetime TV. When the planning for the bombing came out, it turned out that it was planned to take place precisely at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, not 6:58 and not 7:02, but 7. That is the time when all the national networks, have their national television news. That ensured that agitated anchormen would transfer quickly over to Tripoli so that their viewers could see the exciting scenes as they did. About 20 after 7, the White House put Larry Speakes on to run a press conference, followed by other dignitaries. It was a carefully planned public relations operation designed to ensure that, first of all, that the terrorist actions would be visible, and secondly, that the propaganda system would be under tight control of the state authorities during the crucial early hours. That was the actual bombing, largely a public relations operation in which some 100 or so people were killed, mostly innocent civilians, but legitimate, as the liberal intellectuals are quick to explain to us. Now, there was a background for this bombing. The immediate background was a series of incidents that took place in late March of 1986. In late March, the U.S. sent a fleet into the Gulf of Sidra off Libya. This was done with the precise intention of staging a confrontation, of eliciting a confrontation, this has been done repeatedly in past years, and I'll come back to it. The March case was one. The purpose was to elicit a confrontation which would make it possible for the United States to kill plenty of Libyans, as we did. About 50 Libyans were killed in U.S. attacks on Libyan naval vessels. None were rescued by the U.S. naval forces, who were all over the region. It's not because rescue is impossible. In fact, a Spanish oil tanker that happened to be passing through did pick up Libyan survivors and rescue them, but that was not the mission of the U.S. Navy. It was to kill, not to rescue. Now, the U.S. claim is that this was retaliation. It was retaliation against the Libyans who had fired upon U.S. planes 40 miles off the Libyan coast in what we take to be international waters. There are a number of questions that one might ask about that. One is that the law, international law on this matter, is rather vague. States make various claims about the region in which they're entitled to defend their airspace. The United States, for example, claims a 200-mile zone offshore, 200-mile air identification zone, in which it is entitled to, in which U.S. planes are entitled to shoot at and down hostile aircraft. That point was made by Professor Alfred Rubin of the Fletcher School of International Law, pointing out that the United States was on rather weak grounds. It's also on weak grounds in appealing, as it did, to the law of the sea, given that the United States alone refused to ratify the law of the sea at the United Nations. Secondly, the Pentagon claims are probably false. There was an investigation of this matter by a very fine and highly respected British journalist, David Lundy, in the London Sunday Times. He went to Tripoli shortly after the U.S. bombings, and he discovered that there were a group of British engineers there working on the radar system. The Russians had installed the radar system, but naturally were unable to repair it, so they called in British engineers to do the repairs. And these engineers who Lundy interviewed told him that they were monitoring the U.S., the Gulf of Sidra incident. They were monitoring it over Libyan radar. Now, the Pentagon had claimed that Libyan radar had been disabled, but apparently that was false. They said it was functioning and they were monitoring it. And they furthermore reported what they saw. They said that Libyans withheld fire until the U.S. planes had not only come far closer than 40 miles offshore, but in fact had penetrated ground space, had penetrated 8 miles into the ground area of Libya. They managed to do this by following the trail, by following civilian jet planes that were coming into the civilian airports, which enabled them, they hoped would enable them, to the American planes to avoid Libyan radar detection until they were over land. And the British engineers who Lundy interviewed said that Libya withheld any counterfire. They were very reluctant to fire and withheld fire until it was no longer possible to do so with planes, hostile aircraft directly over their ground territory. Now, that report never appeared in the United States, apart from Alexander Coburn, who performed his usual duty as a one-man antidote to the entire American press. But apart from that, it didn't appear. And it's not that, say, the New York Times mysteriously missed this interesting discussion in a major British newspaper by a major reporter. In fact, Joseph Lelyfeld, who's the Times correspondent in London, was well aware of the story. He even referred to this, in one of his columns, he referred to this very column by David Lundy, however eliminating all of its crucial content. He referred to it on some totally irrelevant matter. Well, that was the Gulf of Sidra incident.
You're listening to Noam Chomsky on international terrorism. This is Alternative Radio. You can order copies of this program as well as the book, What We Say Goes, by calling our toll-free number, 1-800-444-1977. That's 1-800-444-1977, or you can order online on our website, alternativeradio.org. That's alternativeradio.org.
Well, let's turn back to 1985. There are several competitors for the worst single atrocity. In terms of numbers, the champion is the Air India jet plane, 329 killed, shot down in a bombing in June. According to the government of India, the trail leads back to Sikh terrorists who were trained in a paramilitary training camp in the southern part of the United States. That fact was tacitly conceded by Edwin Meese in a speech he gave in India. Now, of course, the United States accepts no responsibility for this, but by the standards that we use in the case of Libya, the United States is certainly responsible for this act. That is, if it turns out that some person once visited Libya, or maybe wrote a letter to someone in Libya, and later was found involved in a terrorist act, that makes Libya responsible for it by our standards. So if the terrorists were trained in a paramilitary training camp for terrorists in Georgia or Alabama, that certainly makes the United States responsible for the worst terrorist act of 1985. Well, let's turn to the Middle East region. The worst single terrorist act in the Middle East region was a bombing in February in Beirut, in which 80 people were killed, a car bombing, 80 people killed and 200 wounded. That bombing was carried out by a terrorist group affiliated with the CIA and trained by the CIA, as they had conceded. The CIA stated that they had not authorized this bombing, which is very likely true, but again, by the standards used with regard to Libya, that makes the United States responsible for the major terrorist act in Lebanon, in the Middle East, in 1980. The third competitor for leading terrorist act of 1985 would surely be the Israeli bombing of Tunis on October 1st, although again, if I were not giving the benefit of the doubt to the U.S. and client states, we might call that aggression, as it was called by the United Nations Security Council unanimously, with the United States abstaining. Let's again, keeping to the same principle, call it just international terrorism. In this act, about 75 people were killed, according to a detailed inquiry by an Israeli reporter, Amnon Kapeliuk, who investigated it shortly afterwards and gave the only detailed report, again, not published here. An Israeli attack is in effect a U.S. attack because of the relations between the two, but in fact the U.S. involvement goes much deeper in this case. U.S. complicity in the bombing of Tunis was direct. The Sixth Fleet was apparently, which in the Mediterranean, was apparently withdrawn so that the United States could then pretend that it had no information about the Israeli planes flying to it over an area of perhaps the most heavy U.S. surveillance and radar installations in the world, refueled on flight. Certainly the United States knew about it, but did not even inform the victims, who were close American allies, that the killers were on their way. That's direct U.S. responsibility. Also, the U.S. applauded the act, although it withdrew from open support after an adverse international reaction. Well, that's a major act of international terrorism, to which we can then also chalk up to the U.S. account. It was followed a week later by the hijacking of the Achille Lauro, October 8th. There, one American was killed. This was regarded as a terrorist atrocity, rightly so. It was regarded with much horror, again, rightly so. Now, the hijackers of the Achille Lauro said that it was retaliation. It was retaliation against the far larger terrorist attack against Tunis. Now, that claim that this was retaliation, therefore justified, was dismissed in the United States, and again, rightly. Terrorists always claim that their actions are retaliation against something, and given the cycle of interactions, there's always some truth to this. Now, what about the bombing of Tunis? That was not regarded here as an atrocity. In fact, it was supported by the United States. And shortly after, Shimon Peres, who was responsible for it, the terrorist commander responsible, he visited the United States in mid-October, shortly after the bombing, and he was welcomed as a man of peace. The press reported on how he and Ronald Reagan, two of the world's leading terrorist commanders, discoursed about what they called the evil scourge of terrorism and how we must labor to eradicate it. And all of this was done without irony, as far as I can detect. Now, the Tunis bombing was also described as retaliation. Israel said that the Tunis bombing was undertaken in retaliation, namely retaliation for a terrorist attack at Larnaca, Cyprus, in which 3 Israelis were killed. There was no connection whatsoever between anyone in Tunis and the Larnaca attack, and Israel conceded that fact. Tunis was selected as the target not because of any relation, but because it was defenseless. It always makes sense to attack a defenseless target. It's much cheaper. So Tunis was attacked in retaliation for the Larnaca attack, and that claim was accepted here. Though it was not legitimate for hijackers to take the Achille Lauro, killing one person in retaliation for the Tunis attack in which 75 were killed. It was legitimate for Israel to bomb Tunis with U.S. complicity, killing 75 people, in retaliation for an attack in which 3 people were killed, 3 Israelis were killed, and in which no one in Tunis had any involvement as far as is known. That was the general interpretation here, as you will recall. Now, going back a stage, the Larnaca attack, in which 3 Israelis were killed, there were 3 people in an Israeli yacht, that was also called a retaliation by the people who carried it out. Of course, that claim was dismissed here. They said, in fact, I don't even think it was reported, but they said it was retaliation for the hijacking of ships in the Mediterranean by Israel. And they claimed that the people on the yacht had in fact been involved, which I believe is false, but what is true is that the hijacking had been going on. There's no doubt that Israel has been engaged in large-scale hijacking and piracy on the high seas. This has been going on certainly since 1976. Israeli ships have been hijacking civilian traffic, civilian ships going between Cyprus and Lebanon. When they can find Palestinians, they take them off. They either put them in jail in Israel or hand them over to their allies in Lebanon so they can be killed. There's no secret about this. In fact, Israel openly proclaims the right of piracy and hijacking on the high seas, and it continues regularly. So, for example, yesterday, Israel hijacked a ship with Honduran registry, kidnapping 50 passengers and 8 crewmen, who will undoubtedly be subjected to a kangaroo court trial by a secret military tribunal or treated in some other fashion. We'll never hear about them. I haven't had a chance to read this morning's papers, and I don't know if this latest hijacking was even reported. If it isn't reported, it won't be a great surprise because most of them aren't. That is, we accept here that Israel has the right of hijacking and piracy. The reason is that Israel is a client state of the United States, and therefore it inherits our right of international terrorism from us, just as it inherits the right of aggression from us. Otherwise, we regard international terrorism and hijacking as a crime. This immunity from criticism, in fact, extends much more broadly. You might ask yourself, I'll make up a hypothetical example. You might ask yourself how the American press or the American population or government would react if, say, a Libyan naval flotilla entered the port of Haifa in Israel and sank an American ship, a commercial vessel, and damaged 2 other American ships using missiles made in East Germany. What would the reaction be in the United States like? Would it make the press, for example? Well, it would. In fact, it would probably lead to a nuclear war. Now let's go to the real world. Let's go to last June 5th, 1986, when a South African naval flotilla entered the port of Namibe in Angola, 800 miles from the South African border, sank a Russian ship and damaged 2 others, commercial vessel, using Israeli-made Scorpion missiles, point-by-point analog of the fabricated story that I just mentioned. Well, that didn't make the American press. It wasn't considered significant enough to make the American press. It is not reported in the New York Times or any journal or magazine that's listed in the magazine index, with the single exception of a report in the Washington Post several days later from Moscow saying that Moscow made a protest. Of course, if Moscow had responded the way we would have responded, let's say by firebombing and destroying Johannesburg or something of that sort, we would probably have regarded that as an occasion for nuclear war and a proof of the ultimate evil of the communist devils. But when it happens with someone on our side, it's not even important enough to report in the newspapers, just as the regular piracy and hijacking and so on the part of U.S. clients, or the massive international terrorism sponsored, organized, and directed by the United States, is either not worth reporting or certainly not classifying in this accurate manner. Well, continuing with competitors for leading terrorist incident of 1985 in the Middle East region, the next candidate would surely be Shimon Peres's Iron Fist operations, as they were called in Israel, the Iron Fist operations in southern Lebanon. These were murderous terrorist attacks involving repeated atrocities, for example, military attacks on hospitals, taking patients out of operating rooms and placed under interrogation and imprisonment, attacks on villages with dozens of civilians killed, civilian cars crushed by tanks and so on and so forth. The proclaimed purpose of this, not secret, the proclaimed purpose of this was to keep the population of southern Lebanon hostage. Well, this is wholesale international terrorism, and that the United States is the decisive factor and has been the decisive factor in maintaining this. All of this is related to the U.S. commitment since about 1970 to block any political settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I will just make a brief comment on this is not and nothing that I've discussed is the kind of international terrorism that we're supposed to be talking about. We're supposed to be focused on another kind, the retail terrorism carried out by enemies of the United States. If you look at that very marginal retail terrorism, barely visible in the scale of international terrorism generally, but the one that we're supposed to restrict our attention to, you also discover some things. You find that the terrorists, that the source of virtually all of this terrorism is Lebanon, and that it's mostly since 1982. And if you check the individuals, you find individual histories which quite often trace them back to atrocities in Lebanon, to Sabra Shatila, to other Israeli atrocities. That's where they come from. And in fact, this terrorism was largely engendered by the U.S.-backed 1982 Israeli invasion, and furthermore, that was conscious. You know, through 1981 and 1982, Israel repeatedly carried out provocative actions to try to elicit some sort of PLO terrorism, including heavy bombing, but there was none. Now, the way this is described in the racist American press, for example, the New York Times, by, say, David Shipler, their columnist there, the way it's said is, when they talk about it at all, they say that the border was quiet from 1981 to 1982. Well, that's half true. That is, the border was quiet in that the Palestinians carried out no terrorist acts, but it was by no means quiet. Israel was carrying out regular terrorist acts in an effort to elicit a Palestinian response, which could then undermine the threat of negotiations. That failed, and they finally invaded to try to destroy the civil base of Palestinian society, as they did, and to shatter what was left of Lebanon, with the expectation, which was fulfilled, that the reaction in a devastated country would be individual acts of random retail terrorism on which the West could then focus its horror. And that's pretty well what has happened. Well, what is all this about? I've now talked about the locus of responsibility. What is it all about? It's not very obscure. When the Reagan administration came into office in 1981, it immediately announced that international terrorism was going to be the focus of its concerns. It was going to be the soul of our foreign policy, replacing human rights. We were now going to combat international terrorism instead of defending human rights, as under Carter. And in fact, we have combated international terrorism under Reagan approximately in the sense in which we defended human rights under Carter. Anyone whose head was screwed on knew as soon as these announcements were made that the United States was planning to become engaged in wholesale international terrorism. That was predicted incidentally, and certainly correct. And the reasons were also obvious. The Reagan administration came into office with programs that were highly unpopular among the general public. Now, the media have tended to conceal this fact and talk about a conservative wave and so on and so forth. But if you just take the trouble to read public opinion polls, which are extensive, you will discover that the major Reagan programs, including militarization of the economy and cutback of social programs and its commitment to international terrorism, such as the attack on Nicaragua and so on, all of these policies are highly unpopular by quite wide margins for very quite simple reasons. For one thing, they're part of a large-scale program of transfer of resources from the poor to the rich, an expansion of state power in order to force the public to subsidize advanced sectors of industry, and those are highly unpopular programs. Well, what do you do when you have unpopular programs and you want to make sure that the population remains passive and quiescent? There's a classic answer to this. What you have to do is induce fear, and there's a classic means to do it. You appeal to whoever happens to be the great Satan at the moment. Now, the great Satan for the recent years is the evil empire, the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy planning to take over the world, as John F. Kennedy called it when he initiated rather similar programs. So what you do is say the Russians are coming, and then everyone's sufficiently frightened and you can ram through these programs. However, there's a problem. Confrontation with the Russians is dangerous. We might get hurt. It might be costly to the United States, and therefore it's much better to avoid it. What is needed are proxies of the great Satan, proxies of the evil empire, countries or other groups that are weak and defenseless, who therefore can be attacked and killed with impunity, so there can be a lot of strutting around and manly poses on television and so on, but without any concern that you might be hurt by it. And for that, international terrorism is perfect. It would be very difficult to convince Americans that Muammar Gaddafi or Yasser Arafat or Grenada or the Sandinistas are threats to the existence of the United States. But if they're all tentacles of the evil empire planning to strangle and destroy us, backed with missiles and so on, then the threat becomes a bit more credible. And then we can freely attack the proxies of the evil empire, killing and murdering and torturing and so on, without any concern that there'll be any cost to us here. So that's a lot better. And in fact, that's exactly what the international terrorist campaign has been about. Libya was a perfect choice, particularly against the background of rampant anti-Arab racism in the United States, and it has been used for that purpose since 1981. Since 1981, the United States has set up repeated confrontations with Libya, every one of them for a fabricated reason, every one of them timed to some domestic concern. The March 1986 case was the Contra vote, and every other one was also timed to some domestic concern. No time to review it here, but it's easily demonstrated if you look at the record. Well, that's our concern over international terrorism. I might say that Reagan has drawn these connections quite explicitly, as have his other terrorist associates, Elliot, Abrams, and so on. So, for example, right at the time of the Tripoli bombings, Reagan went on television and explained that Libya is trying to bring the war home to the United States by arming the Sandinistas. Again, that's pretty audacious. Here's a country under terrorist attack by the United States, and it is a base for attacks on the United States, according to the U.S. propaganda system funded by the leading international terrorist, Muammar Gaddafi, whose country we had just attacked, killing dozens of civilians in the leading terrorist attack of 1986. Well, I've talked about the nature of international terrorism and some of the reasons for it. What is the remedy? Well, the remedy seems rather obvious when you consider the locus of responsibility, and the fact that the obvious conclusions are so skillfully evaded, that fact speaks volumes about the moral and cultural standards that prevail in the civilized world. Do I get any pressure from MIT or the government not to speak on these things? And the last part I didn't catch. Do I find my sources of information dry up? Oh, they can't dry up my sources of information because they're all extra formal, usually. But as far as the pressure is concerned from MIT, no. MIT, though it's an interesting case, it's been for years largely a Pentagon-funded university, but it happens to have a very good record on academic freedom and freedom of dissidence. One of the best around, better than most universities. As for the government, well, you know, one of the good things about, a lot of bad things about the United States, but one of the good things about the United States is that the state is, in relative terms, relative to other countries, is relatively limited in its capacity to use violence against its own citizens. I say relatively limited. Of course, it does do it, and the extent to which it does it depends roughly on your privilege. For the more privileged sectors of the population, and I suspect most of us are among them, we're fairly immune from direct state violence. If you're a black teenager in the ghetto, it's a different story. If you're a Black Panther organizer like Fred Hampton, you can be killed by a Gestapo-style assassination with the coordination of the FBI, and nobody will care. But roughly to the degree that you share in privilege, you happen to share in the privilege of being immune from government violence. So the government is restricted against privileged elites, and we're among them. Could some solid sources of information for things that are really happening that are not reported in the American press? Well, one very good source of information is the person I mentioned, Alexander Coburn. He has a column every other week in The Nation. Aside from that, you just have to read widely. If you read the American press carefully, you'll find out a lot. So, for example, if you read carefully, you will discover that Israel is involved in. So let's take the kidnapping business. Israel's commitment to kidnapping and hijacking. I mentioned that I said it wasn't reported in the New York Times. Actually, if you look in the somebody might claim it was reported. In fact, there was a prisoner exchange. Remember, there was one big prisoner exchange about 2 years ago, in which Israel returned, I don't know, hundreds of prisoners, and some, I forget who, Syria or the PLO or somebody returned some Israeli prisoners. And the Times had a front page story about it. And if you read that story, I think in the 18th paragraph, if I remember, next to the last paragraph on the inside page, there was 3 lines which said, among the prisoners returned were, 33, I think, who had been captured by the Israelis extraterritorially. Okay, so if you happen to get down to the bottom of the story, you would have known that Israel is carrying out piracy and hijacking in the high seas. That's the way you got to read the press. There often is something buried on the inside, that you can put together with something else and gradually develop a picture of what's happening in the world. But you have to read very critically, and you have to read broadly. I can't think of any particular source. And furthermore, final comment, there is no source that you should trust. For example, you shouldn't trust what I told you here. What you should do is try to find out if it's right. You should only trust yourself, and that's true no matter what the source is.